Thank you all for being here today. My name is Alex Alsup. I'm the Vice President of Research and Development here at Regrid, joined by my colleague Matthew. Matthew, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, my name is Matthew Klovski. I'm the Geographic Data Manager here at Regrid, and get a little bit more into what we do here and the process of this here coming up next.
And Matthew, where are you webinaring in from
I'm
today?
currently I'm currently in Toronto, but from Metro Detroit originally.
Cool. And I am in Detroit. Um, all right. So to get started here, let's see. To get started here, we'll run through the agenda, and then we'll get going. So we'll start with some background on Regrid. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with Regrid, but for anybody who isn't, we'll give some background on the company and what we do and where we came from. We'll do a quick recap of the owned away from home report, but we want to kind of go beyond what was in the report today as well and bring you some new insights and things that we're thinking about. We're going to focus largely on a particular kind of non-local ownership today, which is in-state non-local ownership. We'll talk about what that is in the webinar. We want to discuss why it matters where a home's ownership sits. And when we typically hear about outside ownership, what kind of outside ownership we tend to hear about. We'll get deeper into that in-state, non-local ownership that I mentioned and that we want to focus on today. And then we'll kind of go into next steps that we want to take for this research, and to the extent that anything should be done about the topic that we're talking about today, we'll share some thoughts there as well. And then hopefully we'll wrap up with something like 15, 20 minutes left for questions and answers. And just to preface as well, I have notes. There's a lot I want to make sure I don't forget to say. So if you see my eyes darting back and forth from screen to notes, I do have some notes here to support me. So to start off with some background on Regrid. So Regrid, we're a company that maintains a nationwide parcel data set covering 100% of US parcels. What are parcels? They are the fundamental organization of land in the United States. They reflect, in short, a property's boundaries. Associated with parcels is data on ownership, land use, zoning, taxation, real estate, and much, much more. You see a few of the fields that Regrid maintains in our data set on the screen here. You can see parcel boundaries as well. Anything that happens on land can be affiliated with a parcel boundary. You can understand land to a certain extent without understanding parcels, but at the moment that you want to imagine doing something differently with land or really interact with land in any way, you have to understand parcels. And so that's been our focus is the importance and primacy of the parcel in understanding and interacting with land. And so we collect and maintain parcel data nationwide. We are constantly refreshing data across the country into a nationally standardized 150 column schema that allows you to do analysis without having to first burn your brain cells out on data wrangling. And it's Matthew and his team that I like to refer to as a team of parcel gardeners, sort of tending to 3,500 county level plots of parcel data all day, every day, and doing an incredible job maintaining this enormous, unwieldy beast of a data set. We also match data sets to our parcel boundaries to take you beyond assessment data into areas like building footprints, zoning data, high frequency ownership data, and matched secondary unit level addresses. I lead a program here called Data with Purpose. It's our academic and nonprofit program. We started Data with Purpose because we remember that when we started Regrid back in 2009, parcel data was incredibly hard to come by. The company started in Detroit, a time when the housing market was, of course, incredibly unstable. People were losing their homes. Speculators were snapping up land across the city, and no one really knew how, where, why it was happening because the data just wasn't available. And so Regrid was founded to try to bring some clarity to the situation in Detroit. We spent much of the first 5 or 6 years of the company focused here. Our first major project was a White House-backed citywide survey of property conditions to help bring both qualitative and quantitative clarity to what was happening to property in the city. And as we expanded nationally, we knew that we didn't want community groups, nonprofits, academics to have to go through what we went through as we were trying to tackle important parcel-based issues that had impacts on people's lives. And so Data with Purpose is a propose your own budget program. You can come to us, tell us what you want to do, and we'll work with you to figure out the best solution. We've served about 125 clients through Data with Purpose. You can see a handful of them here, some of the focus areas that they work on. And again, yeah, we're happy to help you in whatever way that we can. If you want to get in touch with Regrid, if you have data needs and you want to talk to us for businesses, parcels@regrid.com. You can reach out directly there. We got a phone number you can call too. And for nonprofit and academic use, if you're interested in the Data with Purpose program, feel free to email me directly. There's a form you can fill out as well, but you're here already. You can just email me. Okay, so with that bit of background, I want to move on to the owned away from home report. So the report that we published last month, Matthew and I, co-authors on this report, used Regrid's property addresses, ownership details, U.S. Postal Service data, and property tax bill mailing information to evaluate the prevalence of non-local ownership of U.S. housing stock nationally. We defined 2 pretty simple types of non-local ownership that we wanted to look at. One is housing that is owned by an entity out of state, and one is housing that is owned by an entity in the same state but in a different zip code. And what we found is that 1 in 4 U.S. homes are owned outside their local area. About 5% of U.S. housing stock is owned in a state other than the home itself, and about 20% of housing stock is owned in a different zip code within the same state. And you can see the difference in the prevalence between these 2 different kinds of non-local ownership in this map. So on the left side of the screen here, I'll swipe over to kind of expand it a little bit. You can see Pittsburgh, the darker red, the census tract that you see here, the higher the share of housing stock that is owned out of state. If I slide to the other direction, this reflects the share of housing stock at the census tract level that is owned in state, but in a different zip code. And this really holds true nationally. You can explore this map across the country, in the owned away from home report. But really anywhere that you're looking, you're going to find, much higher rates of non-local in-state ownership than you do out-of-state ownership. And, I think we want to start off as well discussing some of the limitations, what this report does and doesn't do, what it tries to answer and not try to answer. And so I'm going to hand off to Matthew to discuss some of that.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So obviously the first limitation is when we're looking at places that are owned by a different entity other than where the house itself is located, you need the tax bill or mailing address to look at that. So obviously we can't do this analysis for places that we don't currently know the tax bill or mailing address for. Thankfully, we have mailing address for about 93% for nationwide parcels, so that's a relatively small proportion of the overall data set that we're excluding there. We also did include international ownership within the analysis. That can be really difficult to discern from assessment data. Sometimes the tax bill mailing address is addresses outside the US, and the formatting of those can be kind of wonky based on the country that we're dealing with there. And there's also things like shell LLCs or whatever like that. So we just really wanted to focus on domestic ownership here and try to reduce the sort of unknown unknowns when we're getting the scope of this data. We also took a look at the housing unit count. So we wanted to get the number of residential situs addresses. There's a little bit of limitation there because there's a count of addresses associated with a given parcel, but that doesn't differentiate commercial versus residential use. So things that are like mixed use developments, like those are kind of difficult to fully ascertain within the data here, the classic, 5/1s or something like that. Also, like some owners may use in-state law firms or management offices for the mailing addresses rather than the actual, their address. So that may be underrepresenting the true out-of-state ownership. So we generally decided it's probably better to lean on the conservative side for these estimates. I think, yeah. Do you want to take this one, Alex? You got it.
No, go for it.
Okay. So yeah, by entity, we don't mean a particular kind of owner. We're not, I think a lot of times people come into this like maybe a preconceived notion of what we're talking about here, but this literally, it could be an individual, a large landlord, local, large-scale institutional investors, nonprofits. It's an obvious next step for investigation, but we are not trying to differentiate by type of owner in this research. And then like the variety of different housing types without distinguishing their use. A beachfront second home is very different from a multifamily rental. And that differentiation is, I think, really important, but like a much broader category that's worth exploring for its own topic in future research.
Awesome. Thank you, Matthew. So before we get much further into this, I think we want to try to give some thoughts on this really foundational question that is, I think, an assumption behind this study, which is that it matters where ownership of a home sits. And so why do we think that that's the case? I think that this is something that we probably all have a intuitive understanding of to some extent, or maybe a firsthand experiential understanding. We were just discussing before the webinar started different experiences with landlords of different distances as one, typology of non-local ownership among many. And so I think if you do have that sort of intuitive understanding, you do have that sort of experiential understanding, I think that's completely sufficient as the basis for an answer to this question. Just because we can throw data at a question doesn't mean that we have to. We all know the adage about real estate prices and location, right? Which is location, location, location explains price. And I think essentially the same rule of thumb kind of applies to where ownership sits as well. But if we do want to look at some data and we do want to consider some sort of anecdotal studies and information, I think there are some good ones to look at. So one is from a longtime Regrid Data with Purpose partner, Western Reserve Land Conservancy, based in Cleveland. There's a 2022 citywide property condition survey completed using Regrid's mobile app, found that non-locally owned homes were deteriorating more so than other kinds of homes relative to a 2017 property condition survey that had been completed as well. In 2017, in Rochester, New York, there was a really interesting study out of McMaster University using longitudinal building inspection data, for which the report mentions that Rochester is something of the gold standard in that realm. And the study found that rental homes owned by absentee landlords had far more code violations than those owned by owner-occupants or resident landlords, where the landlord lives in the property. There are also issues related to the ability of distant capital to outbid local residents. So we looked at this in the Owned Away from Home report, but to put a finer point on it here, in Charlotte, North Carolina, the New York Times documented the prevalence of cash sales to institutional investors in 2021, 2022, who were able to largely outbid local residents. And as you can see from the New York Times map on the left there, and then our out-of-state ownership map on the right, the concentrations of those cash sales closely reflect the concentrations of out-of-state ownership of housing stock that we found in Charlotte. I think exploitation and extractive business models are also a concern that's sometimes found with non-local ownership. This is a quote from Matthew Desmond's Evicted. I think it's worth reading in full, as it explains a really key post-financial crisis dynamic that non-local investors in many cities were able to capitalize on. So I'll read this quickly here, but the same thing that made home ownership a bad investment in poor Black neighborhoods, depressed property values, made landlording there a potentially lucrative one. Property values for similar homes were double or triple in white middle-class sections of the city, but rents in those neighborhoods were not. A landlord might have been able to fetch $750 for a two-bedroom unit in the suburb of Wauwatosa and only $550 for a similar unit in Milwaukee's poverty-stricken 53206 zip code. But the Wauwatosa property would have come with a much higher mortgage payment and tax bill, not to mention higher standards for the condition of the unit. When it came to return on investment, it was hard to beat owning property in the inner city. You buy on the north side because they cash flow nicely, said one landlord with 114 Central City units. In Brookfield, I lost money, but if you do low income, you get a steady monthly income. You don't buy properties for their appreciative value. You're not in it for the future, but for now. This is echoed by a much briefer statement by a landlord in Cleveland that was reported during a vacant property council meeting there a couple years ago, which is, the streets in Cleveland are paved in platinum because the houses are so cheap and the rents have never declined. And so, you know, when we see these kinds of housing dynamics, I think there are a few kinds of non-local ownership that we tend to associate them with. We hear about Wall Street-backed investors buying up single-family homes, or short-term rentals squeezing the housing market. Sorry, just trying to get to the next slide here. Okay, so yeah, we hear about Wall Street-backed investors. We hear about short-term rentals squeezing the housing market. Maybe we hear about foreign ownership. This next example has nothing to do with housing. It's just such a kind of wild story. I wanted to share it. So this example, it was pretty widely reported on at the end of last year. You may have heard about it. So the parcels you see in Regrid data here on the right are alfalfa farms in Arizona that are owned by a Saudi Arabian dairy company. And up until last year, for about 10 years, the company had the ability to pump unlimited groundwater for free from Arizona's rapidly dwindling supply to water alfalfa crops that were then shipped to Saudi Arabia to feed cattle there. The leases were ended last year by Arizona state government, although I think there are additional properties in other parts of the state that have leases that run until 2031 or something like that. But again, these are some of the kinds of non-local ownership that I think we often hear about, and for which there is, you know, some various legislative activity underway. But if you look at the relative scale of out-of-state ownership, short-term rentals, institutional investors, it adds up to about 5% of housing stock nationally. A lot of that is in the out-of-state owner category, which is also going to include things like second homes, vacation homes, things like that. Where the bulk of non-local ownership of the country's housing stock actually sits, though, is amongst owners who are in-state but non-local, in a different zip code to the homes that they own. That kind of ownership is about 20% of U.S. housing stock, 4 times the combined size of out-of-state owners, institutional investors, and short-term rentals. And so that's what we want to focus on today. Again, as you can see in the map here in Atlanta, as I showed in a map earlier, it's a far more prevalent form of non-local ownership across the country. I think it's also important, and something that we want to say from the outset here, that we don't want to cast this as some kind of universally negative thing or something like that. There's a lot going on within this universe of ownership. It's not one thing. Some of these homes are your like quintessential up north, lake house. Some are more like the extractive rental homes that we saw mentioned in Milwaukee and Cleveland. So we're not trying to say that this is a problem. There are problematic traits associated with it at times, for sure. What we're trying to say is that this is a lens that should be a part of understanding housing stock nationally. That where ownership sits is not trivial, and across the U.S. housing stock that is owned non-locally, this is by far the largest group. And so what should we understand about in-state non-local ownership? A few things that we'll discuss here. What are the traits of areas where in-state non-local investors own housing stock? How can we understand in-state non-local ownership geographically? And what is the relationship between wealth and local control of the housing stock? So one of the things that we looked at in the report, and I'll try to explain this chart simply. Matthew was helping me come up with a better way to do so yesterday. Hopefully I honor that. So bear with me for a moment. But what you're seeing here is the average share of housing stock that is owned non-locally by census tract, broken down by median household income. So for example, across census tracts in the top 10% of median household income, all the way to the left on that chart, 13% of the housing stock in those census tracts is owned in-state but non-locally on average. In the bottom 10% of census tracts by median household income, on the other hand, 35% of the housing stock is owned in-state non-locally, a rate 3 times higher than in the wealthiest census tracts in the country. So non-local control of housing stock scales pretty much linearly as income declines. And this is something that you can explore geographically as well. This map is in the Owned Away from Home report. You can feel free to explore it. It's a very simple index that we put together and mapped out, which essentially combines the components that you saw in that last chart. So the darker red, a census tract is, the lower the local control of housing stock, and the lower the median household income. The darker blue a census tract is, the higher the local control of housing stock, and the higher the median household income. And again, you can see this kind of across the country. See, I'll navigate down here to St. Louis as well for another example. And you can see pretty consistently, right, this relationship where urban areas have the more prevalent census tracts with lower incomes, lower control of housing stock, surrounded by more suburban areas with higher incomes, higher local control of housing stock. Moving on from here, I think that there's a broader point to make about wealth and local control of the housing stock. If you look at this map, what it's showing is all of the census tracts nationally that are in the top 20% of median household income and the bottom 20% of values for local control of the housing stock. As you can see, it's pretty empty, and that's the point. If you look a little more closely at the areas that are on that map, and here are examples of a couple of them, they are, I think, to us, kind of the exceptions that prove the rule. The census tracts that are in the top 20% of income and the bottom 20% for local control of housing stock are places like the Hamptons, Lake Tahoe, Palm Springs, Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, so on and so forth, kind of high-end vacation destinations, lots of second homes, things like that. And I think what this all sort of points to is that you rarely find wealth in the United States without also finding local control of the housing stock. Last sort of complicated chart to explain here. So bear with me again. I'll try to keep this straightforward and accessible. So what we're seeing here is the representation of income levels amongst census tracts in the bottom 20% of values for local control of housing stock. This can help us understand the relationship between wealth and local control of the housing stock. So the chart displays each income decile's representation ratio. The ratio compares the actual representation of census tracts by income in these low housing stock control areas to the expected representation if the tracts by income level were distributed evenly relative to their prevalence in the overall nationwide data. So essentially, like that black line that you see at 1 across the screen there, right? If the bars are close to 1, that means that the census that means that census tracts at that income level are represented basically evenly. And so what you can see is that in the lowest income deciles, the bars are exceeding that black line considerably. That's telling us that the poorest census tracts are considerably overrepresented in areas where there is low local control of the housing stock. Conversely, if we look at the wealthiest deciles at the far right of this chart, we see that they are substantially underrepresented. It is rare to find wealth in areas with low local control of the housing stock. As I said before, it's rare to find wealth without also finding local control of housing stock. And so, I think the one of the things we want to say here before sort of moving into our next steps on research and other ideas is, are we suggesting that something should be done? And as we said before, we're not trying to say something universal about non-local in-state ownership as a phenomenon, but rather suggesting better ways to understand it, which is what should happen first. To the extent that non-local in-state ownership indicates a landlord-tenant relationship, which it does at times, but not universally, the cost of error in just trying to address ownership directly can be high. And my opinion is always to operate from a sort of first do no harm principle. I always like to refer to the strong towns process. It's always sort of guided me in this work, which always prioritizes starting with humility and observation and not assuming that you know too much about what you're looking at, and then prioritizes small steps that have material benefits for people. One thing that I think is beneficial about the nature of non-local in-state ownership is that if you do find a problem that you want to address, if there is some dimension that you think needs to be addressed, the mechanisms to do so are probably much more accessible than, say, trying to get Congress to pass a law or a state legislature to do so. You can make meaningful change locally. And I think this is definitely an area where you may be looking at a phenomenon that's national, but the dynamics are going to be very, very local. I'll share a couple of approaches that are related to this topic and I think are interesting. Full disclosure, I've worked on one of them in a previous role, so I'm definitely biased towards it, but I'll share a couple of things that sort of speak to ways that We've seen people try to address problems that are associated with this dynamic. So in Cleveland, we mentioned earlier on that citywide survey that looked at deteriorating housing conditions for non-locally owned homes. And there was actually a local ordinance passed that requires a local agent in charge to be designated if a property owner is outside of Cuyahoga County or a contiguous county. And so it was a pretty interesting and pretty direct response to, we're seeing a change in the conditions of these kinds of properties with these kinds of ownership characteristics, and we want there to be more responsibility taken for the condition of those homes. And then this is the program that I worked on in a prior role. This is a Detroit-based program, which addresses a pretty niche and extreme scenario that was not uncommon in Detroit a few years ago. It happens in other places around the country, but it's a pretty sort of end stage problem associated with rental properties. In Detroit, there are a lot of rental homes where renters face tax foreclosure and the loss of their home because the landlord is not paying property taxes, which is actually a sort of a common business practice for some landlords in the city, especially in the last decade. And so there was a program created by the Rocket Community Fund, where I used to work, local nonprofit here in Detroit, and City of Detroit government, that basically used the state's tax foreclosure system to actually create an opportunity for tenants facing tax foreclosure to become the owner of the home that they had been renting at very, very low cost. And so since the program started in 2017, about 1,500 homeowners, 1,500 former renters have been able to purchase their home for an average price of $4,000 and become homeowners and take local control of their home. It's been a really interesting, very successful program, and it's recently actually expanded to Cleveland. Center for Community Progress did a study on it as well and looked at its feasibility for expanding to other cities around the country as well. We see this topic as one that I think is obviously very large and not something that should be tried to be bitten off all at once. And so we want to keep building on this work. We started with the report. We're expanding on it, hopefully meaningfully here today. And we have ideas of where we want to go next with it as well. And so I want to hand off to Matthew to discuss some of the next steps in research that we have in mind.
Yep. Thanks, Alex. So I think there's obviously all sorts of avenues that we haven't even begun to process yet or understand, things we don't know that we don't know. But I think there's three broad avenues that we have in mind first to pursue for future research here. And the first here is examining the topology of ownership. What does that mean? And what we want to know is when we look at the tax bill mailing address, what is the nature of the property that the tax is being sent to? Is it just a residential property? Is it a business? Is it some sort of PO box? We don't really have a good sense of that currently. And we'd like to take a look at, is there a significant difference between residential and non-residential tax bill destinations for these properties, not only just within the out-of-state category, but also is there a significant difference between that type of ownership in a place that's owned just out of zip code or a place that's owned out of state? So the second one that we want to take a look at here, how is that non-locally owned housing used? We talked a little bit earlier, like this encompasses a broad category of different home ownership. Is it vacation homes? Is it a rental property? Is it just a completely vacant home? Is it tax foreclosure? We don't really have a good sense of that yet. This map here is kind of a good example of this. This is like a little pet project of mine in the past. I've jokingly referred to it as the snowbird map. And this map on the left here, you pan over here, sorry, other way. This one shows all the residential properties that have a tax bill address in Michigan within Florida. So you can see it's all lit up there along the Gulf Coast, Naples, Fort Myers. And you slide it the other way, this is actually the tax bill address for residential properties when it's located in New York State. So you can see kind of a little bit, us Midwesterners appear to prefer the Gulf Coast, and the people from East Coast prefer, well, the East Coast. And even, I jokingly call it the snowbird map, and that gives it an idea maybe of what that residential use would look like. But we don't actually know that that's the case. Are these vacation homes? Are they full-time homes? We don't know yet. I think that's a really compelling topic for future research. And then the other thing that we want to take a look at with future research topic here, the next slide here. Yep. The change in in-state non-local ownership since the pandemic. And toss it over to Alex here to dive into this one a little deeper.
Sure. Thank you, Matthew. And I just want to say, Gage, I saw your question in the chat. There, as Meg said, there will be a recording of this, and definitely appreciate that this, is pretty dense. It's dense for us to try to talk through as well.
Yes.
Which is part of why I have notes here to guide me through it, so I don't miss anything. It's a lot. Yeah, it's a lot to unpack. And we definitely feel it as well. So thank you for being here and sticking with us on it. And so as Matthew said, I think one of the other research areas for us is certainly how non-local ownership has changed from prior to the pandemic to today. This is something I've looked into a little bit in Detroit, and we definitely want to expand the aperture to look at that nationally. But I think the Detroit example is an interesting one. What we've seen here is that since 2019, there's been a 6% decrease in the number of Detroit housing units owned non-locally in Michigan. So 5,400 units that had been owned in Michigan, but outside Detroit, are now owned in Detroit, and they are overwhelmingly owned by individuals. So they're not held in LLCs that just happen to have, Detroit mailing address or sent to some office park in Detroit or something like that. They're owned by Detroit residents by all indications. And what's interesting is that this inflow of housing ownership to Detroit is happening against a backdrop of rising home values. So the median home sale price in Detroit has doubled since 2019, from $40,000 to $80,000. And you might think that would cause these non-local owners to want to hold on to an appreciating investment or buy more of them, something like that. But instead, we're seeing some of them sell. And so, I kind of hear echoes of that Matthew Desmond passage and that landlord in Cleveland here. It may be that the very extractive business model that made cities like Detroit attractive in, the 2010s, low home prices but high rents, is actually not as attractive as home prices rise. And to an extent, property taxes rise as well, especially in Detroit amongst new sales, and expectations around property maintenance rise as well. Owners, those non-local in-state owners may be figuring that it's better to just take some money off the table and get out of that business, because the real estate market doesn't support that model as well anymore. Again, I'm sure there's lots of other things going on here. I'm not sure that that is, a total explanation, but it is very notable to us to see that, in the last decade, as home prices declined, outside ownership increased. And since the pandemic, as home values have increased, outside ownership has started to decline. And so that inverse relationship is really interesting, and definitely something that we want to build on.
I just want to add here on this too. When
Yeah,
we talk
please,
about
of course.
understanding the breakdown and difference between the use of these properties, we have a little bit more detail here in Detroit because of Alex's past experience and work within it, and this detail of understanding that 70% of these are owned by individuals, not LLCs. Understanding this more fully on a national scale in other places obviously helps inform those policy decisions around those properties, because you need to understand the structure of that first before any sort of policy mechanism or decision there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so with that, thank you again. Thank you all so much for being here. Really appreciate your interest in the topic, and for sticking with us as we try to unpack something that we think is, really important, but definitely dense. And so we have time for questions and answers and discussion. And Matthew, anything you want to add at the end here as well, please?
No, I'm just looking forward to hearing people's questions and happy to answer as many as we can get through here.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all so much. I'll stop sharing my screen. And I know that Meg, I think, has been um, moderating the chat. Thank you very much to Meg for doing that. Uh, Wonderful. And yeah, please, yeah, feel free to drop any questions that you have in the chat. And of course, also feel free to, get in touch with us. Um, Meg, if I could ask you to maybe drop that, you can drop my email address in there, drop the parcels@regrid.com address in there. But yeah, if you'd like to get in touch, have any questions, please let
Yeah.
us know. Um, so I see
First
a
one
question.
from Dan. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Matthew, please.
Yeah, I see this first one from Dan Troop here asking about, have we done any work to connect owners, the ability to see where an owner lives in the Midwest and their home in Florida? That's a great question. That is something that I'd absolutely love to be able to do. It's a tricky thing linking back the situs address to the mail address and then looking at the sort of nature of the property that the mail address is linked to. But I think it's something that like we're very interested in taking a look at and pursuing. I could foresee a sort of future analysis where you start building almost like a family tree, essentially, of properties of just like tracing back, okay, this house is owned by this property, which is owned by this property, which isn't, and see how far that chain goes and get a relative measurement of like how deep does that chain extend for a given property, and like what's the average of that based on like out of state home? Is it like 3 layers of ownership? Is it just two? Does it go to just one house? Yeah, it's a really fascinating sort of future topic to take a look at for sure. So we haven't done it, but we want to.
And then I see Eric's question. Do you see doing state-specific presentations to groups? We'd be happy to. Yeah, no plans for it, but certainly, yeah, if it's something that would be of interest, feel free to drop a line. Happy to discuss it for sure. And then switching over to the Q&A side here, question from Aaron. Um, as you mentioned, investors have gotten savvier at hiding their identities using real estate attorneys and specialized companies as registered agents for LLCs on the tax bill. Do you have any thoughts or strategies about how you might go about uncovering who these owners really are? Um, yeah, I mean, there are data sources out there that can help us with that. I've used open corporates in the past to get at some of those issues. Um, yeah, I was looking at Aaron, you might have seen this, but I was looking at a landlord here in Detroit, where just relying on tax bill address alone, I couldn't figure out the full extent of his portfolio, but using our data in conjunction with Open Corporate's data, I was able to find out that he had 500 and I think it was 575 homes across the city in 380 different LLCs. So yeah, I mean, there's some pretty expansive LLC use that's possible if you're, I guess, really well organized and have a really well paid attorney to organize and manage all of that for you. So yeah, I think there are definitely opportunities to go further and unpack some of that with additional data that's out there. And then, Jesse, does the housing data you're tracking include all single family and multifamily properties? So anything one unit and up? Matthew, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. We're looking at residential, like just truly in a pure sense of like, is there a residential structure there that either has people living in it or could have people living in it? We're not, yeah, it's not looking at just single family or something like that.
And then from Susan, it's very difficult to get contact information for owners, even when you can find out who they are. Any suggestions? Um, so yeah, it's not something that I've dealt with a whole lot directly beyond. I mean, property tax bill mailing address data can be a good way to send a letter to someone because presumably someone's paying attention to what's coming into that address since the property tax bill is mailed there. Um, we don't maintain contact information as a data set. So I wouldn't have any more sort of specific recommendations than that. But But there are sometimes, academic studies, sometimes we use property tax bill mailing address data as a way to, send a survey to someone, try to collect information that way. And then from Frank, how do local regulations and policies impact the viability and profitability of non-owner occupied housing investments in Detroit? Yeah, that's a really good question. I didn't get into this in the Detroit example, but the city has a rental ordinance that came online, what, 2018,
About
2019,
that.
something
Yeah.
like that. It is the compliance rate with that rental ordinance is like 7% of rental units citywide are compliant. So no one really complies with it. But there have been some higher profile cases of the city going after landlords who were, had large portfolios and were egregiously in violation of the rental ordinance, bringing suits against them. And so I do kind of wonder again, as you see that sort of like rising property values, conditions in in neighborhoods improving, are some of those landlords in a city like Detroit looking at the rental ordinance and just saying like, I don't want to deal with this stuff. I'm going to get out, right? The conditions that made my business model attractive and profitable in a city like Detroit or Cleveland or Milwaukee, are changing. And this rental ordinance is sort of a harbinger of that. And so I just want to take my money off the table, and I'm not gonna engage with the
Yeah.
market anymore.
It almost seems like, at least in this specific case, and obviously a local case to Detroit, like the relative efficacy of the reforms are like compliance is less important than just the fact that like they're existing in the first place.
Yeah. Um, and then I see in the chat, Dan. First of all, thank you very much. Really appreciate that comment. And then from Stephen, do you know if there is a greater likelihood for landlord-owned properties to be vacant? Stephen, I almost got up this morning and said I should look at the vacancy rate for non-local in-state owned housing nationally, and then I thought that would be too much, and I should spend my
Shame on
time,
us. Shame on
yeah,
us.
going over my notes this morning. Yeah, so we do, Regrid does maintain U.S. Postal Service data that's updated monthly, that reflects the Postal Service's understanding of whether a property is occupied or vacant. Um, I use that data a lot in Detroit. I find it to be quite useful here. I can go out and ground truth it easily. It's really pretty remarkably good. It's really good at, I should say, it's really good at identifying when a property goes from occupied to vacant. Um, in the context of a city like Detroit, yeah, Eric, correct. I think especially
Absolutely
with
agreed.
second homes, it gets harder. If you're looking at a place like Detroit, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Gary, Toledo, right? If you're looking at cities, Chicago, I think the vacancy data is very helpful. If you're looking at the coast of Florida, it's not going to be telling you the same thing, right?
Yeah.
But I do find it very useful. And yes, I think we can absolutely look, and that's a really interesting question, right? Like again, you have these when we hear about non-local ownership, especially in relationship to affordability, right? You hear about Wall Street investors outbidding local prospective homeowners. You hear about short-term rentals, creating pressure on the housing market. But I'd be really interested to see like to what extent is vacant property held by non-local owners essentially removing stock from the market because it's sat on speculatively, and not contributing to absorbing the demand for housing. I think that's a really interesting direction for research as well.
I do want to add a little bit of a counterpoint. So, like, vacancy is obviously a tough definition with those second homes. But something that we have noticed with USPS data is that it's actually pretty good at accounting for and taking into account like the sort of seasonal ebb and photovoltaic vacancy, some previous work that Alex and I have taken a look at, and it was in Nantucket, right? Like we found that like for places that were seemed like as vacant, we did when we took a look at the historical vacancy data for those properties, we didn't see a sort of seasonal ebb and flow depending on when the USPS vacancy was actually like taken note of. It stayed pretty, if a property was vacant for that and had been for a while, the USPS would know it was, it was vacant in June, it was vacant in December, it was vacant in March, at different points throughout the year. Um, which was, a little surprising, right? We have expected maybe to see a bit more ebb and flow there than we did actually.
Mm-hmm. And Jesse has a question. There's a narrative that Wall Street is buying up a disproportionate amount of single-family homes, but this data seems to undermine that story. 5% of out-of-state ownership nationally does not sound disproportionate. How has this number changed over time? Yeah, I think this is a really good sort of two-part question. So the first part, so that 5% out-of-state ownership figure captures a lot more than institutional Wall Street backed investors. It's probably I'm guessing it's probably mostly vacation homes. That's sort of my assumption, or at least the plurality of that number is probably vacation homes. The Urban Institute study that I mentioned found nationally that institutional ownership of single family homes amounts to 575,000 units nationally, which is, a fraction of a percent. I think that, the Wall Street narrative, I mean, it's a compelling narrative in and of itself. It also, I think, has an outsized impact. My sense is I can't say I've investigated this a whole lot, but I think it has an outsized impact in certain markets. So you look at that example like Charlotte, right, where there's a lot of that activity, and it is having a real material impact on the ability of people in that city to become homeowners. But it's heavily concentrated in a few neighborhoods. I wouldn't be surprised if that is sort of a phenomenon that we see nationally, that there's pretty intense activity, as Wall Street is wont to do, to find the market where it is, it's going to get the best return on its investment, which isn't everywhere. And that there are certain markets that fit its strategy very well, and that there's pretty intense activity in those areas. Um, uh, but it does seem, yeah, I think it's a very small percentage of activity nationally. And then how has that number changed over time? I think is again a really interesting thing, and that's really, again, we showed that sort of just snippet of insight into that topic in Detroit. Definitely, to me, that's the most exciting sort of next step to take is, what does this look like over time nationally? Our I think we're probably in a position to look sort of just before the pandemic as the sort of earliest frame that we could go back to and compare it to today to a pretty substantial extent nationally. So that would definitely be something that we're excited to look into, and definitely want to follow up with everybody on in the future as well. And then, Aaron, do you know if there's a correlation between non-local ownership and higher rates of blight, tax delinquency, or eviction? Um,
Depends.
yeah, yeah, it's a good question. Again, I think that Rochester study indicated, what was found in Rochester was that, uh, absentee landlords did have, far higher rates of code violations. Um, I can certainly say in Detroit, yeah, absolutely. There's a higher rate of tax delinquency, vacancy, blight, all those things amongst non-locally owned properties. To the extent how, looking at considering that nationally, I think the closest that we could probably reasonably get to it is looking at vacancy as a kind of a kind of a proxy, and also its own sort of category. but no, I think that's a really good question as well.
Yeah, I'd love to be able to see how that varies just like broadly at a national level, just given like the fundamentally different way that like the rental market operates in a Rochester, New York or a Detroit compared to, a San Francisco or something
Hmm.
like that.
Yeah.
And also the relative boundaries of like counties or cities, obviously, like you're dealing with just like I think of fundamental like the geographic like ratio of that. Like someone owning outside of San Francisco County isn't that crazy, but San Francisco County in itself is on the smaller side of things.
Cool. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat here. Of course, you've got ways to get in touch with us if other questions come to mind you want to discuss further. Of course, feel free to reach out. Um, and Yeah, thank you all again so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you to my co-author, co-presenter Matthew.
Thank you.
Thank you to your data team for wrangling all this data all day, every
We
day,
melt our
and
brains so you don't have to.
that's absolutely true. That should be our motto. Yeah. Uh, Thank you all so much. And we will follow up with more. We have more that we want to do with this. We're trying not to eat the entire elephant in one bite. It'll take a while, and we want to keep working on it.
Do it right. Yeah.
All right. Thank you all. Take care.